Michigan did repeal their right to work law after a decade of having it be in place. The Democrats took the House by one vote and the Senate by one vote and had a Democrat governor and Gretchen Whitmer. And on the first day of the legislative session, when they convened, they introduced a bill to repeal right to work. So workers now in Michigan are forced to pay union dues or fees in order to keep their jobs. It's outrageous. We'll continue to fight.
You're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm your host, Kerry Lutz. Hey, got an interesting guest for you today, and we're going to be talking about labor issues in the country. Is the Republican Party about to head off of a cliff? Social Security Union is keeping teleworkers in their contract for 4 years, but I don't believe that's going to hold because DOGE is going to blow right through them. Mark Mix, National Right to Work Committee. Mark, great to have you on the show. You know, Trump and the Republican Party, it's become the party of the working man. And yet, a lot of what he wants to do, certainly in the government, well, government worker, I've always thought was a bit of an oxymoron, shall we say, or a contradiction in terms. But this thing of letting them telework, which means no work, for 4 years, how is that going to hold up?
Well, Kerry, look, thanks for the opportunity to come talk to you about all this stuff. You're right. It's kind of an interesting realignment that we're seeing politically, this idea that the Republicans now are the representatives of the working class. But one thing that remains clear, Kerry, is when you think about, labor, we talk about labor, we misinform people and misdefine what labor is. When you're talking about labor, you need to make sure you're talking about American workers as opposed to union officials. The separation is dramatic and getting wider all the time between the union officials on one hand and the rank and file workers they claim to represent. There's a growing chasm ideologically, politically, however you might define it, between union officials and workers. So Donald Trump won the hearts and minds of the American working class by talking about a secure border, smaller government, enforcing laws against crime, keeping boys out of girls' restrooms and locker rooms and out of sports, things like that attracted, common sense voters. Union officials, on the other hand, continue to push for this collectivism that's been damaging and has had significant impact on the economy and other things. And Kerry, to your point, Joe Biden, as a parting gift to the American Federation of Government Employees, agreed to a contract that allows the Social Security Administration workers, 49,000 of them, to continue working remotely over the next 5 years. But I think you're right. I think there'll be a challenge to that. I think Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have something to say about it. And I know you do too. So
yeah, well, I think it's absurd that they can work from home. I mean, there might be certain instances and certain classes of employees who can work from home, but people that you need to supervise on a day-to-day basis who are making decisions here that are very important to the individuals involved. How do you let those people work from home?
Yeah, you shouldn't. I mean, we're only using, according to Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, we're only using about 10%. And there was a Federal News Service Network survey. Only 10% of the leases in the operation buildings in D.C. are being utilized right now. And we're paying like $7 billion a year to lease them or to operate these buildings, and they're only being 10% utilized. Something's wrong with that picture. And as a taxpayer and as a citizen, we ought to be very, very concerned about that, to your point. The efficiency and the effectiveness of government, I think, is predicated on their ability to be supervised. To your point, Kerry, I mean, look, we may think that the human nature says, yeah, I'll work hard, but I suspect that we're not as efficient and we're not as effective as a government by letting, 90% of the workers or whatever it is. I mean, I know the unions and CNN and the Washington Post and others have defended this, saying, yeah, well, it's not as big as problem as you think. But your point about efficiency, effectiveness, and being able to manage really gets hurt and gets hit hard when a large percentage of workers are working from home.
Yeah. So, I mean, I like the hybrid idea of them working, 1 or 2 days a week at home, as long as they could be monitored effectively and, they're actually doing what they're supposed to do, because there's benefits for employees when you give them that flexibility, and hopefully they return the favor in increased productivity. There's a lot of, my daughter and son-in-law, both full-time remote workers for big corporations, and I know that they work their butts off.
Yeah. There's a bottom line there, Kerry. Somebody's paying attention to their work, for sure. And when you think about like the VA, the Treasury Department, HUD, the Labor Department, the Education Department, they still haven't gotten back to 50% on-site workforces yet, even though the Biden administration and the chief of staff there, Jeff Zients or whatever his name is, basically sent a letter to all these agencies that said, you're not doing your job. Get those people back in the office. I mean, this is just as recently as a couple months ago, when we're still, 4 years outside of this COVID, pandemic that led to all this. So there's a lot that still has to happen. I think, to your point, Musk and Ramaswamy are going to have something to say about it. Unfortunately, Kerry, there's going to be litigation. The unions will bring lawsuits because all of this remote work, for example, the American Federation of Government Employees represents allegedly 800,000 federal workers, and all of their contracts contain a requirement that you bargain over any changes to remote work policy. So there'll be litigation for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to see, because a lot of those people they want to get rid of anyway, right?
Well, I think so. One of the things they're saying is that probably we could reduce the size of government fairly significantly and still get the same productivity and the same results from a government that's smaller. And I don't have any particular opinion about that other than to believe it by people who work it there, look at government and say, yeah, there's some efficiencies that can be made. And anybody, whether it be Republican or Democrat, that says you can't cut anything out of government is lying to us, Kerry. We know that. Yeah. Lying to us.
For sure. For sure. And I reckon, and there's all these useless agencies. It's all part of the Washington issue here, right?
Yeah. Indeed. When you think about the mayor of Philadelphia demanding that all of the government workers in Philadelphia come back because she knows what it's doing to the local economy, the restaurants and the shops downtown in Philadelphia. Muriel Bowser, the mayor of D.C., has issued an edict that everyone has to come back to work, and she's asking the federal government to make sure they get 100% compliance with people working in buildings, because now these little mom and pop businesses down in Washington, D.C. that relied on that foot traffic every day for lunch or breakfast or coffee, those people are really, really hurting. So there's a whole bunch of different issues that fold into this. But the most important thing, and I think the thing that I get concerned about, is the actual monopoly power that union officials have in the public sector, in the government sector. It was Franklin Roosevelt, Kerry, back to our conversation briefly at the beginning about the 1930s and labor policy. He was asked about the unionization of government, and he said it's unthinkable. It's intolerable that you would organize unions in government because they're not the same as the private sector. That is so obvious to anyone who understands Economics 101 that the idea of putting a private organization in between elected officials and people that vote for those elected officials and giving them privileges above ordinary citizens is something that really has been detrimental. And you look at the states that do this, quote, really well: California, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, where basically unions control 60 or 70% of the government workforce. Those states are literally hovering on the abyss of financial destruction because of these decisions.
Yep. Nevada is also one of those states too, right?
They've made promises too. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So how does this get resolved here? Like your organization, a lot of states have passed right to work laws, but now they're in the midst of trying to roll them back, like in places like Wisconsin, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And Nevada, there's been talk about it in Nevada and Arizona and Wisconsin. Michigan did repeal their right to work law after a decade of having it be in place. The Democrats took the House by one vote and the Senate by one vote and had a Democrat governor and Gretchen Whitmer. And on the first day of the legislative session, when they convened, they introduced a bill to repeal right to work. So workers now in Michigan are forced to pay union dues or fees in order to keep their jobs. It's outrageous. We'll continue to fight it. I think one of the most important battles, though, to your point, Kerry, coming back to the government sector, is states can actually roll back the power of government unions. And hopefully the federal government will do the same thing. I don't think the Republicans in the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House have any appetite for this because they like the money that comes in. They don't want to upset, these large lobbies that have literally hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on politics. The Democrats would do it. They would increase government power dramatically. Republicans just say, well, if we just do it gradually over time and just take a finger and a hand and an arm and an elbow and a shoulder, and we don't any vital organs, we can probably get away with this stuff. And that's kind of what's happening. But I think one of the narratives of this next 4 years is going to be reducing the number and size of the federal government. And I think that'll trickle down to the states, too, because I don't think the financial situation for many of the states is going to be improving. And Kerry, I know you'd know more about that, but literally the state of California, the state of Illinois, the state of New York, they are, again, on the precipice of a financial disaster.
Yeah. The only thing that staved it off, I guess, was the COVID aid that they got from D.C., and that's all gone now. And now they're left looking for the next grift. And in the meantime, a state like New York, where I used to live, Wall Street's moving to Florida. I mean, Miami is now the financial capital of the United States. It shifted from New York almost overnight. Nobody noticed it, but I noticed it 10 years ago when I moved down here, that hedge funds were gradually moving operations here to avoid taxes, regulation, and for other reasons that crime, that these cities have become unmanageable, and the pathogen, the woke mind virus that was sweeping New York. I mean, it's made the place unlivable.
Yeah. Well, those quality of life issues are pretty important. One thing we do know about the right to work states, Kerry, is that they have been magnets for new manufacturing job growth and new economic development and new investment in capital in states like Texas and Florida and, Idaho and Wyoming and Arizona and the right to work states around the country because of, to your point, that kind of regulatory environment and the idea that it's easier to do business in a state that basically takes care of people and understands the importance of bringing investment, bringing economic development, bringing capital to states like they've done in Florida. And certainly Wall Street's a big part of that. And we've seen that. A lot of, hedge fund people actually ask questions about labor policy as they're looking at investing in companies. And we're seeing more and more of that. And we're seeing a bolder kind of CEO culture that actually makes the point about mentioning, look, we want to take care of our employees. We don't want a third party in between our employees and us. And that brings the question of, union accountability. One of the simple things that a right to work law does is it gives the worker the power to hold a union official accountable. If the union officials are stealing their money, if they're doing politics that they disagree with, workers can say, you know what, I'm not going to pay for this anymore. And in right to work states, they have that right to do that. Forcing states, if you don't pay, you lose your job. So that's an attractive part of some of this move that we're seeing. And it's not just because they have air conditioning in the South now. It's because they have better policies.
Hey, well, just to give you, for example, in Florida, the latest budget was $116.5 billion. In New York, it was $229 billion. Florida now has roughly 20% higher population than New York, although we don't know, it could be even higher than that after the next census. New York's population's been static. Florida's manages to run the state. We can argue about how well any state is run,
sure,
over 50% less. So the point is, we have no income tax in Florida. So therefore, it's limited how much they could take. They get toll roads, they get higher closing costs. Real estate taxes might be higher in certain instances, but basically, by any measure, Florida is better run than New York.
Yeah. And I would guess, and I don't know this, but I guess the total tax burden is significantly less in Florida than it would be California, notwithstanding the user fees and some of the other issues with real estate taxes. I would guess that'd be the case. But then again, you're right, creating an environment where you accept capital, you accept investment, you accept, these opportunities to grow and to help people feed their families and increase their cost, their standard of living. That's happening across the country. To your point about the next census, we've estimated based on just preliminary numbers that we're looking at that the right to work states will gain somewhere between 13 and 14 new electoral votes because of the population shifts to those states that have these policies intact.
Yeah. Yeah. No doubt. Yeah. For sure. Florida is ranked kind of in the middle in total tax burden to the lower, but by every measure, Florida is better run than any of these failing states. Florida is not a failing state. I mean, it's got a rainy day fund of some $20 billion. We have our issues here, obviously, the insurance issue, storms, the illegal immigration issue. We have a lot of problems, just like Texas, like any state, any country, right? Every country in the world. I mean, I don't know where this panacea is. I've been looking for it my whole life. I haven't been able to find it yet. But
if you find it, let me know, would you? Yeah.
Connecticut's effective tax rate is 15.4%, according to the Tax Foundation. And that was in 22. I assume that they haven't changed very much. Florida's is only 9.1, but you go to a place like Wyoming, it's 7.5. California is 13.5. New York is 16%. So we see all these numbers here. They don't mean anything unless you're the one getting taxed, right?
Yeah, that's right. We actually take the Tax Foundation data and we do a comparison between right to work states and non-right to work states. And I think the latest data set that we've looked at shows that you have fulfilled your tax obligations about 3.5 weeks earlier in right to work states than non-right to work states. So that means that you get an extra 3.5 weeks of pay for disposable income because you've settled up your tax burden with the government 3.5 weeks earlier than states that have forced unionism policies.
Hey, want to hear something funny? You know what state has the lowest effective tax burden?
Do I dare guess? Let's see. Give me 3 seconds, and I will come up with no answer. Go ahead.
Alaska, of all places.
Alaska. Yeah, well, that's because they get those severance taxes on energy. Everyone gets a check for like $10,000 a year or whatever it is, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what the current admin did to Alaska with resource projects that they want is clean energy, but they won't license copper mines. Go figure. Wyoming is number 2, and Tennessee is number 3. Florida is number 11, which isn't that bad in the scheme of things. But anyways.
And I think Alaska's a better place, or excuse me, Florida's a better place to live than Alaska. There are many people that argue with me on that, but maybe you...
Certainly in the winter. Certainly in the winter, that's the case. In the summer, maybe not so much. Hey, Mark, tell us how we find you, how we connect with you on the web.
Yeah, you can find we have 2 operations. One, we have a legal defense foundation that does nothing but help employees exercise their rights under the law. That's the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. That is NRTW.org, NRTW.org. And then the committee where we do our legislative work, both in Congress and in all 50 states, is the National Right to Work Committee, NRTWC.org, NRTWC.org.
All right. Links in the show notes. This interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. We just ask that if you go to the site, please sign up for your free newsletter like over 60,000 other FSN community members have. And if you got a question for Mark, myself, KL@Kerry Lutz, that's the email address. Mark, really appreciate your stopping by. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Kerry. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.